The phenotype of two Middle Eastern types, the Natufian Afrasian Semite versus the Caucasus hunter-gatherer Armenoid Iranian.
But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video.
So we covered before the two best locations when it comes to the origins of Semites, one being the Levant with the Natufians, and two being North Africa. Ancestral Semites would begin to appear around the Neolithic as pre-Proto-Semites, whether it's North Africa or the Levant with the Natufians. Also, both locations had haplogroup E. So here's just showing you a map of where Proto-Semites would have came from when it comes to coming out of North Africa. And just to quickly read the source dealing with it, this implies that the speakers of Proto-Semitic were still dwelling in Africa in the 5th millennium BC in the Neolithic sublume, circa 5,500 through 3,500 BC, when the Sahara's climate was much wetter, so that erosion took place, as in other moist temperate or subtropical regions, and there was a proper system of rivers and vegetation consisting of trees with grass. A worsening of environmental conditions is indicated in North Africa circa 3500 BC, with disappearance of vegetation, a major faunal break, desertification, and desertion. This might have been the period when the speakers of Proto-Semitic passed through the Nile Delta from the west to the east and reached Western Asia, where written documents in the 3rd millennium BC perceived noticeable traces of pre-Semitic, and in Mesopotamia also of pre-Sumerian substring. Thus, from North Africa, wave after wave of Semitic migrations would have seemed to set forth. The earliest of these migrants and those who went furthest to the east were the Akkadians, who journeying along the Fertile Crescent through Palestine and Syria and crossing over into Mesopotamia, reached northern Babylonia circa 3000 BC and founded the first Semitic empire at Kish. That is from Semitic Languages, Outline of a Comparative Grammar by E. Lipsky, and dealing with the genetics of it. Genetics, history, Genetics, Egypt, and History, Interpreting Geographical Patterns of Y chromosome Variation. And it says it can be postulated that select M35 carriers, speakers from Africa of a stage of ancestral Semitic, pre-Proto-Semitic, entered the Near East. And so that's basically the North African origin. And now we're going to deal with the Natufian origin. As you can see, the Natufians were in the Levant, and then Semites would have expanded from the Levant. This paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. That was from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory. The identification of Proto-Afrasians as Natufians and post-Natufians seems to satisfy all the 4 criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are sets of reconstructed Proto-Afrasian terms pointing to inseparate animal breeding. Finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where population began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean and Africa. That's from the Prehistory of a Dispersal, the Afroasiatic Farming Lexicon. This finding contrasts with both earlier Neolithic and Epipaleolithic Natufian populations, which were dominated, Levantine populations, which were dominated by haplogroup E. And that is from ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel, reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. So, Caucasus hunter-gatherers, on the other hand, were nowhere near the homelands of haplogroup E. Caucasus hunter-gatherers were in Western Asia of the Caucasus and had haplogroup J. So here's the area where we found the remains, as I said, western part of Georgia in the Caucasus Mountains. And it says both Georgian hunter-gatherer samples were assigned to haplogroup J with Catos belonging to the sub-haplogroup J2A. In a study exploring J haplogroups in 445 individuals from Eurasia, J2A was found at highest frequency in Georgia and Iraq. It is intriguing that both the mitochondrial and the Y chromosome haplogroups of our ancient Georgian samples have been associated with the Neolithicization of Europe. This tentatively suggests a genetic link between Georgian hunter-gatherers and early European migrants from the Near East, and that is from Upper Paleolithic genomes reveals deep roots of modern Eurasians. With that being said, what did each group look like? How different would an ancestral Semite from Neolithic North Africa and Natufians with haplogroup E look like from the Caucasus hunter-gatherers with haplogroup J? So, Neolithic North Africa, let's deal with that. So their phenotype would likely be an Eastern or a Saharan Ethiopic type. Ethiopic type that was more common during the Neolithic when the Sahara was still green. Physical traits would be reddish brown through black skin, tight curly hair, and dolichocephalic or mesophalic. The Kiefian culture is a prehistoric industry or domain that exists between approximately 8000 BC and 6000 BC in the Sahara Desert during the African humid period, referred to as the Neolithic subplume. Craniometric analysis indicates that this early Heliocene population was closely related to the late Pleistocene Ibero-Maurusians and early Heliocene Caspians of the Maghreb, as well as the mid-Heliocene Mechta groups. So that's what a Kiefian looks like, ancient North African. Here are Ibero-Maurusian reconstructions, and credentials is to the side if you want to find it. So basically, Neolithic North Africans were dark-skinned, dark curly-haired, and dark-eyed. Now let's deal with the Levant Natufians. So it is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, however, the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and the other samples used. This placement suggests that there may have been a sub-Saharan African element in the makeup of the Natufians. As shown in Figure 1, the Somalis, the Egyptian Bronze Age sample from Naqada, may also have a hint of a sub-Saharan African component. Here's just a chart showing you how close Niger-Congo is to Natufian. And here's another chart showing you that Natufian will fit in between Niger-Congo and a prehistoric / recent Northeast Africa. So, if the late Pleistocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance as the late prehistoric Eurasian elements, and that is from the questionable contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European craniofacial form. So there's basically how a Natufian would look very similar to a Ibero-Maurusian, an ancient North African. So the Natufians of the Levant would have been dark-skinned, dark curly-haired, and dark-eyed. So how about a Caucasus hunter-gatherer? To explore further, we looked at genotypes in two pigmentation genes proposed to have been strongly selected in these ancestors of modern Europeans, namely SLC45A2 and SLC24A5. Select SNPs in the SLC45A2 and SLC24A5 genes contributed to lightening of skin and are almost fixed in modern Europeans. We found that Caucasus and Serbia have the ancestral version of the SLC45A2 variant, but both Caucasus hunter-gatherer have the select version of the SLC24A5 gene, encompassed by the most commonly associated haplotype C11, found in modern populations. We found it in most likely that Bichoan, Caucasus and Serbia had dark hair, dark black hair, and brown eyes. And to me, I would say that the Caucasus hunter-gatherers probably had an Aramaean phenotype, since this is the typical phenotype of that geographical area. Basically, they would have been short-headed and high skull type with fleshy features, a flat occiput, and hooked nose, often black-haired with light brown skin, common in the mountainous regions of Asia Minor, especially Anatolia and Armenia. And here's basically an Armenoid, how the Caucasus hunter-gatherer likely looked. So Caucasus hunter-gatherers were basically light-skinned, dark-haired, and dark-eyed. Now what's interesting about the contrast between ancestral Semites, like the Neolithic North Africans and Natufians, from the Caucasus hunter-gatherers is that one of these ethnic groups fits the skin tones of Shem, while the other fits the skin tone of Japheth. This is from Perke de Rabbi Eleazar, and it says, he especially blessed Shem and his sons, black but comely, and he gave them the inhabitable earth. So Shem is black and comely. He blessed Japheth and his sons, they are entirely white, and he gave them for inheritance the deserts and its fields. These are the inheritance with which he endowed them. So Japheth is white. This is from the history of the messengers and the kings, and it says, the children of Sam, or Shem, settled in the center of the earth, which is between Satrama and the sea, and between Yemen and Syria. Allah made the prophets from them, revealed the books to them, made them beautiful, gave them a black complexion, luminous and free of blemish. So Shem has a black complexion. The children of Japheth settled in Safwan toward the north. They are light-skinned and very fair-skinned. So Japheth is light-skinned and fair-skinned. This is from the Persian historian Tabari. Born to Noah were Shem, whose descendants' color are a black complexion with a light brownish undertone and a dark blackish brown. So Shem is black complected, light brown complected, dark blackish complected. Japheth, whose descendants are very fair-skinned and olive-skinned. So Japheth is fair and olive-skinned. This is from Ibn Abbas. He said, Allah made the descendants of Sam and the descendants of Ham black-skinned, and he made the descendants of Japheth white-skinned. So both Shem and Ham is black-skinned and Japheth is white-skinned. This is from the 13th century Christian Ibn al-Abri, and he says, Shem, the land of the browns. So Shem is brown. And Japheth, the land of the reds. So Japheth is red. So according to ancient Jewish, Muslim, and Christian writers, Shem's descendants are associated with dark-skinned peoples ranging from a light brown to black, whereas Japheth, on the other hand, is described as white-skinned. Looking at the Natufians and Indo-Europeans, they match more closely to Shem, and Caucasus hunter-gatherers match more closely to Japheth in terms of skin complexion. When we look at ancient Semite depictions and artwork, we can actually see a closer association to the Natufians rather than Caucasus hunter-gatherers. This is from Archaeology and the Sumerian Problem, and it says the brown Euro-African variety of the dolichocephalic population at Kish and other variety, the brown Mediterranean type, which is related with the West, can hardly have been anything but Semitic, for it is certain that we have to account for Mediterranean Semites from Arabia at the early date in Mesopotamia. So the Semites are connected to this brown, Euro-African brown Mediterranean type. And this is from reports on the human remains found at Kish, and it says, this report on the human remains found at Kish by the Field Museum and Oxford Expedition is based on the material excavated in the old Sumerian palace at eastern Kish. All remains from the palace, or in our terminology, Mound A, belong to the period immediately preceding the age of Sargon of Akkad and are contemporary with the last 4th dynasty of Kish, circa 2900 through 2800 BC. The names of the 8 rulers of this period indicated clearly a Semitic dynasty. So when we're dealing with these Kish remains, we're dealing with Semites. The population at Kish in the period to which the human remains of the palace belong should be therefore very mixed. Dr. Bixton finds 2 long-headed races in the palace skulls at Kish, which he designates as Euro-African and Mediterranean. There can be little hesitation in asserting this type to the people who have been called by Elliot Smith the brown race. So let's deal with Elliot Smith's the brown race. So this is from A General History of Africa, and it says, particularly when we note once more that Mediterranean is not a synonym for white, Elliot Smith's brown or Mediterranean race being neither the mark. Elliot Smith classes these Proto-Egyptians as a branch of what he calls the brown race, which is the same as Sergei's brown or Euro-African race. The term brown in this context refers to skin color and is simply a euphemism for Negro. And here is Elliot Smith's book, The Ancient Egyptians and the Origin of Civilization. And it says, the Mediterranean and East African littorals into the whole peninsula of Arabia, into the shores of the Persian Gulf. In other words, Syria, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and Sumer were parts of the original domain of the brown race. The Proto-Egyptians, so I'm just going to explain what the brown race would have looked like. So the Proto-Egyptians, but there can be no doubt whatever that their dark hair was associated with dark eyes and a bronze complexion. Wall paintings and statues with black eyes and ruddy brown skin. Brown skins and irises of a black and dark brown color, as the living populations of northeastern Africa, which most nearly resemble the Proto-Egyptians in stature, have a coppery brown skin color. We must look upon the old Egyptian customs of representing men of their nationality with red skin. So going back to the reports on human remains found at Kish, it says down below, these 2 types both belong to a group of humanity which is classified as a single race by Hadean, who, while apparently associating the brown race with the Mediterranean race, includes a further group, the Semites, of whom only one group, the Bedouin, here concerns us. So Hadean talks about this as well. So when it comes to the Euro-African, here is Hadean's description. This is from the Contributions to the Anthropology of Iran, and it says, skin, dark complexion, hair, dark, eyes, dark, head, very long, which could refer to dolichocephalus. Nose, often broad, so a wide nose. Pronathonism, often slight, so they had some pronathonic jaw, which means the protruding of the jaw. So this is from The Passing of the Great Race, dealing with the Mediterranean race. And it says, the Mediterranean race was first described by Sergi, who also calls it Eurafrican. The Mediterranean race originated in Africa and is closely related to the Negro, both being long-skulled peoples descended from a common stock, the Eurafrican. And this is going to do with Proto-Semites specifically. This is from the Contributions to the Anthropology of Iran, and it says, in a private conversation, he writes that the sequence is correct for Mesopotamia. As for example at Kish, where the Mediterranean Proto-Semite is under the Sumerian Alpine, he adds that the primitive Mediterranean type equals the Galas, etc., of Somaliland and Kenya colony, which in turn equal the Proto-Semites. So basically, peoples of East Africa sort of would represent a Proto-Semitic phenotype, which is kind of interesting when you think about Joktan. But anyways, so when we look at the murals in ancient Mesopotamian civilizations at places like Mari, which was an ancient Semitic state in Syria, we do see that the murals depicted of these Semites are kind of like what we just read, dark, brown-skinned people with black hair and dark eyes. And I have to the far left just an image of two people, a man and a woman, who phenotypically kind of match what we see on these murals from Mari, just a simple brown-skinned people with dark hair and dark eyes. Ancient Semites in Mesopotamia are generally, considered to be African-looking in a sense, we covered various Semitic groups in the past, and generally they have been described as, African or Negroid or Ethiopic, etc. We cover like the Joktanites, the Elamites, the Chaldeans, and we can actually cover more in the future. I have a lot more to cover. But just to do a quick recap on these ancient Semites, the Joktanites. I'm only going to do three sources each, because by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every word be established. So let's do Joktan. Joktan, Quaktan, or Khaktan. Joktan's descendants are called Joktanites. There is an Arab tradition that Joktan was the ancestor/progenitor of all the purest Arabian tribes of central and southern Arabia. Joktan, son of Eber, and by him connected with the Hebrews and other Semitic or Shemitic families. He is believed to be the Khaktan or Joktan, to whom Arabian writers trace their purest and most ancient genealogies. There is an Arab tradition that Joktan, Khaktan, was the progenitor of all the purest tribes of central and southern Arabia. This is from the Geographical Journal, A Periplus of the Persian Gulf by Arnold Wilson, and it says, the people of Dhofar are of the Khaktan tribe, the sons of Joktan, mentioned in Genesis. They are of Hamitic or African rather than Arab types. And so here is a chief from Dhofar, as you can see right here. So basically, when that guy was talking about that, this is what Joktanites look like, is saying that they look like these guys. This image, by the way, comes from the ancient and modern inhabitants of Arabia. So here is the African presence in early Asia, and it says, the Encyclopedia Britannica gives a description of the physical qualities of the original Arabs. The inhabitants of Yemen, Hadramaut, Oman, and the adjacent districts, in the shape of the heat, colors, length, and slenderness of the limbs, and scantiness of the hair, point to an African origin. They claim descent from Khaktan. These Yemenite kings descended from Khaktan and Hamir the Dusky, a name denoting African origin. The general characteristics of the institutions of Yemen bore considerable resemblance to the neighboring ones of the Nile Valley. And this is from the nations of the southeast, early Israel and the surrounding nations. And it says, the people of Sheba belong to the South Arabian stock, In both blood and language, they differed considerably from the Semites of the north. Physically, they bore some resemblance to the Egyptians, and it has been suggested that the Egyptians were originally immigrants from their shores. Some of them crossed the Red Sea and founded colonies in Africa in the modern Abyssinia, where they built cities and introduced the culture of their former homes. Like the Egyptians and the Babylonians, they were a literary people. Their inscriptions are still scattered thickly among the ruins of their towns, written in the letters of the alphabet, which is usually termed Phoenician. And so there's a depiction of, just ancient Egyptians. So here are depictions of Sabaean statues along with peoples of the Red Sea. And I would say that they match perfectly. Specifically, these are Abyssinians. And that's probably how Joktanites looked. Now let's just deal with Arabians in general. This is from the book called The Arabs, and it says, the original inhabitants of Arabia then, according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists, who has made a study of the Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a much more darker people. A proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world from Africa to Malay, giving rise to the Hamitic peoples of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. And this is source right here is from the Negro in the New World. It is quite conceivable that the great peninsula of Arabia was once populated as far as its natural conditions allowed by a primitive Negro stock. This is from Henry Field, and it says, among these Negroid features which may be counted normal in Arabs are the full, rather everted lips, shortness and width of nose, certain blanks in the bearded areas of the face, between the lower lip and chin, and on the cheeks, large, lustrous, griselle-like eyes, a dark brown complexion, and a tenderness for the hair to grow in ringlets. Although the Negro of today is sharply differentiated from although the Arab of today is sharply differentiated from the Negro of Africa, yet there must have been a time when both were represented by a single ancestral stock. In no other way can the prevalence of certain Negroid features be accounted for in the native of Arabia. And just here are some just depictions of various Arabian types. So the Elamites. This is from Prehistoric Nations, and it says the region known as Susnia was politically connected with Chaldea from the earliest times. It was occupied by people of the same race, who in the course of time may have developed a Susnian dialect of the common language. This region was probably included in the district first colonized by the Cushites. Its ruins are of great antiquity and show plainly their Cushite origin. This is from Lectures on the Origin and Growth of Religion, and it says, as, however, M. Diallafour's excavations on the site of Susna have brought to light laminated bricks of the Elamite period, on which a black race of mankind is portrayed. It may mean that the primitive Sumerian population of Chaldea was really black-skinned. And this is from the Negro in the New World, and it says, the Elamites of Mesopotamia appear to have been a Negroid people with kinky hair, and to have transmitted this racial type to the Jews and Syrians, an evident Negroid element in Babylonia. And here are just depictions of Elamites, various depictions, and it's quite clear what they look like, these being a people that come from Shem, according to the scriptures. and the Syrian Arameans. Let's deal with them. And it says, indeed, they are especially contrast with the black Syrians, excuse me, who are said to live east of the Armenus and must consequently be Arameans. And by the way, they're contrasting them from the other Syrians, the white Syrians, who are Hittites. And this is from the greatest empires and civilization of the ancient world. And it says, the Cha'ab Arabs, the present predecessors of the more southern parts of Babylonia, are nearly black, and the black Syrians, of whom Strabo speaks, seem intended to represent the Babylonians. And this is from a dictionary of Greek and Roman geography, and it says, Lycio Syri, the ancient name of the Syrians inhabiting Cappadocia, by which they were distinguished from the more southern Syrians who were of a darker complexion. And so here are some depictions of Bedouin Syrian types right here that were depicted in Egypt by Ramses III. And here are some Arameans from the period of, I believe, the Iron Age. They're being conquered by Assyria. And what's interesting about these two depictions is that obviously the skin tone, but also the fact that they had these, I would say, these head wraps or head hair bands, which may indicate that these may have been the same people. But this was made by the Egyptians, and this was made by the Assyrians. So it's kind of interesting. Now with the Chaldeans, another Semitic type. This is from Prehistoric Nations, and it says, all the best qualified investigators agree that the evidence already obtained shows conclusively the Cushitic or Ethiopian origin of Chaldea. And this is from a book of the Beginnings, Volume 2, and it says, the primitive Chaldeans and Babylonians were known to the Greeks by the names of Chaldeans and Kiphians. The Kiphians were synonymous with Ethiopians. And this is from the Beginnings of Civilization. And it says, the Cushite Arabians and possibly the Chaldeans, the founders of the first historic civilization in Babylonia, began being certainly Hamitic, though early mixed with Semitic tribes long before the Assyrian rule. And here are just depictions of Chaldeans. These are you can find this image at the the University of Cambridge. And I blocked out the name of the captives because when we get to the captives, when we get to a certain time, I'll reveal who those captives are. But to the far left of the screen are the Chaldeans, and here's just a closer image. Clearly, dark-skinned people. So all these Semitic groups are basically dark-skinned, dark-haired, and dark-eyed. Here's just everything put together that we covered. And generally, they all pretty much look very similar. Like I said, being dark-skinned, specifically medium brown to dark brown, dark-haired, dark-eyed, ancient Semitic types throughout Middle Eastern history. So these groups, they generally, look African, but this makes sense if Semites are Africans, if you hold the older view, which is a belief held by scholars in anthropology, by the way. A conversation with Christopher Ehret says, after all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. Early West Asians resembled Africans. That's from a comparison of craniofacial features of major human groups. So early Semites would have been these early West Asians looking like Africans. Makes sense. Personally, I would say that early Semites looked like Bedouins and Arabians, basically peoples on both sides of the Red Sea. They are, ancient when it comes to their DNA, anyways, because they're more like isolated Middle Eastern populations. This is from the genetic history of the Middle East, and it says Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines. Curiously, ancestral E-star lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. And of course, another reason why Bedouins and Arabians are great is because they have really old E markers. And that's from carriers of mitochondrial DNA, microhaplogroup L3 basal lineages migrated back to Africa from Asia around 70,000 years ago. And here's, just an example of some Arabians. And here's an example of some Bedouins. So basically, early Semites range from medium brown to dark brown and black skin and complexion. So here's just a representation of how I feel the early descendants of Shem would have looked like, whether it's an old Earth or a young Earth. 6,000 years or, a couple of million years, it doesn't matter. This is what early Semites would look like once we get to the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and even today. But this is in stark contrast to the Caucasus hunter-gatherers. It would seem like Caucasus hunter-gatherers would descend from more of an Armenoid Japhetic stock. Here's again the Armenoid phenotype, just to remind you. They're light to white skinned and could even be tanned with dark hair and dark eyes. Therefore, with all that being said, I would say, even physically speaking, when it comes to the Middle East, you do have two Middle Eastern types, basically Japheth and Shem. And here is where we conclude the phenotype of two Middle Eastern types, the Natufian Afrasian Semite and the Caucasus hunter-gatherer Armenoid Iranian. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe, click the bell, share the video, and leave a comment for any questions you might have. And follow my social media accounts for updated information. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.